For over 20 years, one man convinced millions of Christians that a genre of music was a doorway for the devil. He stood on stages holding a Bible in one hand and a stack of rap CDs in the other and told entire congregations to burn them. He built a ministry empire on a single, unshakable claim that hip-hop, not the lyrics, not the artists, the culture itself, was rebellion against God, and no amount of Christian words sprayed over a beat could change that. His name is Pastor Craige Lewis, and for a generation of black church kids in the 2000s and 2010s, he was either a prophet who saved them from spiritual destruction or the man who made them feel like sinners for owning a Lecrae album. Today, that same man is at the center of something very different. Not a theological argument, allegations, online testimony, a church he built with his own hands now facing questions from the inside out, and a community that once hung on his every word is now asking whether the man who spent 2 decades warning them about hidden sin in the culture might have been hiding something of his own. This is the story of Craige Lewis, how he built it, how he fought for it, and what's happening to it now. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why this story has split the Christian hip-hop world in two, all over again. To understand why this moment matters, you have to understand who this man was to an entire generation. Craige Lewis was born in 1969, and by the time he stepped into ministry, he wasn't interested in being a background pastor at a mid-sized congregation. He wanted a mission, and he found one in what he believed was the single greatest threat facing young black Christians in America: hip-hop culture. In the early 2000s, Lewis founded EX Ministries, EX standing for Exposing the Enemy's Tactics, built almost entirely around one message. Hip-hop is not just a music genre, it's a subculture with its own spiritual roots, its own value system, and its own gods, and those roots make it fundamentally incompatible with the Christian faith. He turned that message into a book and a DVD series called The Truth Behind Hip-Hop, and it spread like wildfire through churches, youth groups, and Christian schools across the country. If you grew up in a black Pentecostal or Baptist church in the 2000s, there's a good chance somebody in your youth ministry played one of those DVDs for you. Lewis didn't just say some rap lyrics are inappropriate. He argued something much bigger and much bolder, that hip-hop as a culture, the fashion, the language, the posture, the swagger, was born out of rebellion, and that rebellion doesn't get sanctified just because you slap a gospel message onto it. In his view, hip-hop was, in his words, a living, breathing thing with its own spirit, and you couldn't baptize a spirit. You could only cast it out. That message made him famous. It also made him a target. Alongside the hip-hop crusade, Lewis eventually became senior pastor of Adamant Believers Council, often shortened to ABC, a congregation that at various points has been based in Grand Prairie and North Richland Hills, Texas. For his members, Lewis wasn't just a media figure doing DVD series and radio broadcasts. He was their shepherd, their weekly voice, the man who married them, buried their parents, and told them how to raise their kids. That dual role, national anti-hip-hop crusader and local pastor with real authority over real people's lives, is going to matter a lot later in this story. Because when you're both a media personality and a pastor with hands-on control over a congregation, the stakes of any controversy are doubled. It's not just, did a public figure say something wrong? It's, did the person shepherding real families betray that trust? But before we get to that, we need to talk about the fight that made him famous and made him enemies in the first place. If you were anywhere near Christian hip-hop culture between roughly 2006 and today, you know this next part. Craige Lewis didn't just criticize secular rap. He went after the artists who were trying to use hip-hop for the gospel, and that's where things got personal. His core argument, repeated across sermons, interviews, and his DVD series, was simple to state but explosive in its implications. Hip-hop is a subculture rooted in rebellion against authority, and rebellion cannot be redeemed just by changing the words. In his framing, an artist rapping about Jesus over a trap beat wasn't spreading the gospel, they were smuggling a spirit of rebellion into the church wearing a gospel costume. He wasn't shy about naming names either. Some of the biggest figures in Christian hip-hop, most notably Lecrae and the label Reach Records, became direct targets of his critique. For anyone who wasn't around for this, you have to understand how big Lecrae and Reach Records were, and are, in this space. Lecrae is arguably the most commercially successful Christian rapper in history. Someone who's crossed over into mainstream music charts, collaborated with major secular artists, and become something like a bridge figure between the church world and the broader hip-hop industry. Reach Records built an entire roster and movement around the idea that hip-hop could be redeemed, that you could take the art form, keep its authenticity, and use it to preach the gospel to people the traditional church would never reach. Lewis said essentially, not possible. And he said it loudly, repeatedly, and without much room for nuance. In his view, rapping Christian lyrics around a genre rooted in what he called rebellion didn't elevate the music, it diluted the gospel message underneath it. You weren't redeeming the culture. You were letting the culture redefine what you were willing to compromise on. This wasn't a quiet theological disagreement between two Bible college professors. This played out publicly, in sermons, on radio, and DVD releases, and call-out videos, and eventually all over social media, once platforms like YouTube and later Twitter and Instagram gave both sides a direct line to millions of young Christians. And because so many young people in black churches had grown up on both, Lecrae's music and Lewis's DVDs, this fight didn't feel abstract. It felt like it was splitting families and youth groups down the middle. Do you trust the pastor who says the culture is the enemy? Or do you trust the artist telling you God can use anything, even hip-hop, to reach people? It's worth saying clearly, this was never really settled. There was no moment where one side won. Lecrae and Reach Records kept building, kept reaching bigger audiences, kept putting out music that ministered to millions of people who never would have opened a church door otherwise. And Lewis kept preaching that no matter how big Christian hip-hop got, no matter how many souls people said were saved through it, the foundation itself was still compromised. What this fight did, more than anything, was establish Craige Lewis as one of the most polarizing figures in black church culture of his era. You either saw him as a bold truth-teller willing to say the unpopular thing no other pastor would say, or you saw him as a legalistic gatekeeper who used fear to control what young Christians were allowed to enjoy. And that reputation, bold truth-teller or controlling gatekeeper, is exactly the fault line that's now reappeared. Except this time, it's not about music, it's about him. Here's something a lot of people don't realize. This isn't the first time Craige Lewis has faced serious personal allegations. It's not even the second time real cracks have shown up inside his own church. Go back to 2012. Reports and accusations involving Lewis's personal conduct began circulating, and it was serious enough that a portion of his own congregation left Adamant Believers Council over it. At the time, there wasn't a mountain of hard, verifiable evidence in wide public circulation. A lot of what spread was word of mouth, rumor, and testimony rather than documented proof. But the effect was real regardless. People who had trusted this man with their spiritual lives packed up and walked away. That's important context, because it tells you this pattern, allegations, some members leaving, the ministry continuing on largely unchanged from the outside, isn't new. It happened over a decade ago, in a much smaller media environment, without smartphones in every hand and without the kind of instant, unfiltered platforms we have today. Then came 2020. This time it wasn't just rumors circulating quietly. Former high-ranking staff members and former congregants, people who had been on the inside, who had worked closely with Lewis and his leadership team, started releasing testimonies. And they weren't scattered or random. Multiple former members, independently and in a coordinated wave, described a similar pattern. A leadership culture built around control, descriptions of manipulation, a lack of real accountability at the top, language that in more than one testimony characterized the environment less like a healthy church and more like something closer to spiritual control. Some former members went as far as using the word cult to describe how tightly Lewis and his inner circle held onto authority over people's personal lives, right down to who they were allowed to have Bible study with outside of church-sanctioned settings. Now, to be fair and precise here, because this matters, these are testimonies. Personal accounts from former insiders, not court findings or independently adjudicated facts. But when you get multiple people, unconnected to each other in some cases, telling strikingly similar stories about the same organization, that's the kind of pattern that outside observers, other pastors, journalists, and everyday churchgoers started paying very close attention to. By 2020, in other words, the questions being asked about Craige Lewis weren't just, is his hip-hop theology too extreme? They were becoming questions about the health of his church itself, and whether the same intensity he brought to warning people about outside cultural influences was also being turned inward on his own members. That's the backdrop. That's the pattern already sitting there, years before the events of this year. Which brings us to now. In 2026, a new and much more serious wave of allegations broke into public view, this time centered specifically on claims of extramarital affairs. Unlike the broader leadership culture testimonies from 2020, this round of controversy was sharper, more personal, and spread faster because of exactly the kind of platforms Lewis himself had spent 2 decades warning his followers about. Here's what's circulating, and I want to be careful and precise with you about how I frame this, because a lot of it is unverified, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise just to make a more dramatic story. Multiple women reportedly came forward with allegations connected to Lewis. Independent online channels and creators, including accounts like the BCV or Book, a Chapter Verse channel, began live streaming and discussing claims tied to alleged personal digital material said to contain evidence of misconduct. Alongside this, testimonies from former members, some posted on platforms like TikTok, describe specific alleged incidents, including one widely shared account describing an uncomfortable and inappropriate interaction that allegedly took place years earlier and only resurfaced publicly as this new wave of scrutiny built momentum. I want to stop and be really clear here. None of what I just described has been independently verified by me. And as of this video, I haven't been able to confirm official statements, legal findings, or confirmed responses that settle these claims one way or the other. What we have is a lot of online testimony, a lot of secondhand reporting through independent Christian commentary channels, and a community that is reacting in real time to claims that are still, as of now, allegations, serious ones, but allegations. What is true is the effect all of this has had. This story didn't stay contained to one corner of the internet. It moved through Christian YouTube and TikTok commentary spaces fast, the same spaces where, ironically, Lewis built so much of his own platform warning people about the enemy's tactics in secular culture. Other faith leaders started weighing in publicly, with some voices in ministry circles calling for accountability, for a pause, a step back from the pulpit, a season of transparency, and, if the claims are substantiated, repentance and a structured path toward restoration rather than simply continuing on as if nothing happened. And that's really the heart of where this story sits right now. Not at a resolution, but at a crossroads. A ministry built on the idea that hidden spiritual compromise will always eventually surface is now facing the question of whether that same principle applies to its own founder. So why has this particular story generated so much reaction, more, honestly, than a lot of other church scandals that come and go without much national attention? A few reasons, and I think they're worth sitting with for a second instead of just moving on to the next headline. First, the irony. This is a man whose entire public brand for over 20 years was built on exposing hidden spiritual compromise in other people's lives. He told an entire generation that secular hip-hop was dangerous because it looked one way on the surface and had a different spirit underneath. That's the exact language people are now using to describe the allegations against him, something that looked one way from the pulpit and may have been something very different behind closed doors. You don't have to believe every claim to understand why that framing lands so hard with people who grew up watching his DVDs. Second, the power dynamic. Lewis wasn't just a media personality putting out content people could take or leave. He was a pastor with direct spiritual authority over a congregation, people who submitted to his teaching on marriage, on obedience, on who they were and weren't allowed to study scripture with outside of his approval. When a leader with that level of control over people's personal lives faces allegations like this, the damage isn't abstract, it's personal, for every family that restructured parts of their life around his teaching. Third, and this is the part that I think matters most for the wider Christian hip-hop conversation, this reopens a fight that never actually got resolved. Remember, Lewis spent 2 decades telling artists like Lecrae that you can't take something built on a compromised foundation and expect it to hold up spiritually over time, that eventually the rot underneath shows. Now critics, including some who were on the receiving end of his criticism for years, are pointing back at his own ministry and asking the same question he used to ask about hip-hop. What was really underneath this? To be fair, that comparison cuts both ways, and it's worth saying so directly. One person's serious personal failure doesn't retroactively prove or disprove a theological argument about music and culture. Plenty of people have pointed that out too, that even if every allegation here turns out to be true, it doesn't automatically mean Lewis's specific arguments about hip-hop were wrong, any more than it would mean they were right. Those are 2 separate conversations, even if they're emotionally tangled together right now because of who's involved. But you can't really talk about why this story spread the way it did without acknowledging that tangle. For a lot of people who felt judged, restricted, or even shamed by Lewis's teaching over the years, people who lost friendships over CD burnings, who felt like their taste in music got treated as a spiritual red flag, this moment landed with a very particular kind of weight. So where does this leave things? As of now, this is still very much an unfolding story. The allegations from 2026 haven't been resolved in any formal or independent sense that I can confirm. Adamant Believers Council hasn't disappeared, it's still an active congregation. EX Ministries hasn't shut down, and Lewis himself remains a significant figure in this space, whatever comes next. What's changed is the environment around him. A community that once treated his word as close to final on questions of spiritual purity is now openly asking, in public, whether the standard he held everyone else to applies to him. Former staff and former members who once might have stayed quiet are speaking on camera. Other pastors who might have avoided commenting on a fellow minister's personal life are now weighing in, some calling directly for accountability rather than silence. And regardless of how the specific allegations from this year are eventually resolved, there's a broader pattern here worth naming honestly. A pattern going back to 2012, resurfacing again in 2020, and resurfacing again now in 2026. 3 separate waves, over more than a decade, of people close to this ministry describing concerns about how power was being used inside it. You can hold healthy skepticism about any single unverified claim and still recognize that a pattern repeating across 3 separate periods involving different people each time is not nothing. What this story ultimately becomes may depend less on any one piece of evidence and more on how Lewis, his leadership, and his church choose to respond, whether that's silence, denial, partial acknowledgement, or a real reckoning with the people who say they were hurt along the way. That's true in almost every version of a story like this, no matter who the person at the center is. Whatever you believe about Craige Lewis, whether you think he was right about hip-hop, wrong about hip-hop, a hero to your household growing up, or a pastor whose control over people's lives went too far, this story isn't really about music anymore. It's about what happens when the person telling everyone else to watch for hidden compromise gets asked the same question about himself. We'll keep watching how this develops, and if there are real updates, statements, responses, anything that moves this from allegation to confirmed fact one way or the other, we'll cover it. If this video gave you the full picture, drop a like, subscribe if you want the follow-up when this story develops further, and let me know in the comments. Do you think ministries like this can actually hold their own leaders accountable, or does something structurally have to change first? Let's talk about it down below.